Okay, good morning everyone. We're going to continue to look at digital graphics, but at the request of some of you, I'm going to look specifically today at how you can write up limitations of different hardware and software and how you can compare these. So, limitations of different hardware and software. First of all, I'm going to quickly define what we mean by a limitation. Okay, so here's it straight out of the dictionary. A limiting condition, restrictive weakness, lack of capacity, inability or handicap. For example, he knows his limitations as a writer. Something that limits, a limit or bound, a restriction, an arm's limitation, a limitation on imports. Okay, so for example, a limitation would be something that you cannot do with the software, for example, or something you cannot do with hardware. If we think of an iPad, one of the limitations of the iPad is they don't play flash content. So some websites don't work on iPads because they have flash animations on there, and Apple refuse to allow their browsers to display flash. That would be a limitation of an iPad. Okay. For M1, you're asked to compare the limitations of different hardware and software packages used in graphics work. The compare is the important thing here. To examine two or more objects, ideas, people, for example, in order to note their similarities and differences. To compare two pieces of cloth. To compare the governments of two nations. So the important thing to be aware of here is that you're looking at perhaps the advantages and disadvantages of something. You need to choose two items or more to compare the limits of them. Where are they the same and where are they different? So, what have you got to do? Choose a range of software. I'm going to suggest you go with something like Photoshop and Paint, both of which are on the software both of which are installed on the computers at school. I would also suggest you choose a range of hardware. Again, at least two things. Maybe try digital camera would be a good example. Think about both the advantages and the disadvantages of them. And then, in what way are these limiting? Okay, so if one of the advantages is something, think of the limits of that. If the disadvantage of a digital camera is that it only has 5 megapixels as its picture rate, how does that limit the things you could do with that camera? Then compare those limitations. Okay, compare the two cameras against each other, for example. These are the limits of one camera, these are the limitations of the other. Okay, keeping compare in mind, I'm even suggesting how you might want to lay this out. You might want to create a table with software, the limitations, and then a comparison column, and then repeat the cycle for hardware. So the same example I've used here would be digital cameras. What are the features of them and how could you compare how they are limited? Your tasks for this week, as in up till Wednesday at least when we have our double lessons. Find two cameras that you can compare the limitations of. You could compare, for example, a Canon Ixus with your camera on your phone, for example. And then I want you to look in slightly more depth at Adobe Photoshop and Paint and decide what you think are 3 limitations of each piece of software. Write those up in detail and bring those to Wednesday's lesson, ready to discuss them as a class, ready to sit down and say, okay, well, Photoshop was really good, but this was something that was quite difficult about it, and that's a limitation. Paint was alright, it couldn't do this, and it couldn't do that. Those are limitations. Okay? Right, relatively short presentation there. Carry on with both the tasks I've set today and the first task of the unit as a whole. Good luck, people. I will see you on Wednesday.